When we think of winter in medieval England, a deceptively pastoral picture comes to mind. The fields are covered in snow, the hard work of harvesting is behind us. It seems that for the peasant comes a time of well-deserved rest. He sits by the fire in his humble hut, fixing tools, telling children stories and sleep-long nights, waiting for the arrival of spring. We see winter as a pause, as a lull in the eternal battle for survival. But what if this picture is just our romantic fantasy, born of the comforts of the 21st century? What if winter was not a respite, but a most insidious and many-faced foe, requiring not less, but quite different efforts than summer suffering? What if the hut was not a refuge, but a stuffy, smoky workshop where work never stopped for an hour? And the forest was not a fairy tale thicket, but an arena of risky and often illegal struggle for the right not to freeze to death. The life of a peasant in winter was not hibernation, but a continuous series of urgent, varied, and exhausting tasks. It was a battle on several fronts at once, against the cold that penetrated every crevice, against the hunger that became more real every day, against the destruction that threatened tools and dwellings, and against the despondency that the endless darkness brought with it. The question remains, could you, a man of our time, endure even one day of such medieval hibernation? The answer lies in 10 unexpected activities that made up the routine of a peasant winter day, and that were a real test of the strength of body and spirit. The first myth that crumbles when looking at winter life is the myth of rest after the harvest. The harvest, gathered in August, did not magically turn into flour. It lay in the barn in the form of huge stacks and sheaves, looming over the family as a mute reminder of the labor ahead. Winter was the time of threshing, long, hard, monotonous, and hazardous labor that turned the barn into a dusty prison and the lungs into a slowly dying organ. At the first rays of the winter sun, and often before, men and young men would go to the cold, droning barn. They spread out the sheaves on the compacted earthen floor and picked up the chains, the main tool of the season. The chain was a long handle to which a short, heavy beater, often made of hard thorn or oak, was attached by a leather strap or a hinge of wiry cowhide. The work required not only brute strength, but also the strictest rhythm. 2 or 3 threshers stood in a circle and struck one by one, in rhythm, so as not to injure each other. This deafening, percussive pounding echoed throughout the village from morning to evening, setting the somber rhythm of the winter day. The air in the closed barn, lit only by a strip of light from the ajar door, quickly filled with thick, acrid, golden dust, a mixture of straw, chaff, mold spores, and dry earth. There was nothing to breathe. The dust clogged his nose, throat, lungs, and settled on his teeth and tongue. Constant piercing coughs were the professional disease of the threshers. Over time, the work led to chronic respiratory disease known as threshing consumption, a slow and agonizing fading away. This was the literal price of bread, paid with one's health. After the grain was beaten from the ears, it was the turn of the women and children. Their task was to wind. On a windy day, the large through gate of the barn was opened. Women used wooden shovels or special wicker windrowers to throw the mixture of grain and straw into the air. The wind would carry the light husks away, and the heavy, precious grains would fall on the bedding. It was also a long and laborious job, requiring skill and patience. And only after that the grain could be poured into sacks. But even here the peasant was not a complete master. Part of the grain, the tithe, went to the church. Another part was to be given to the Lord as a tax. Another part had to be given to the miller for grinding, because grinding grain at home with hand grinders was often forbidden, so as not to violate the Lord's monopoly on the mill. And only what was left belonged to the family and had to feed them until the new harvest. And straw, seemingly a waste product, became an invaluable resource. It was used to feed livestock, stuff mattresses, mend roofs, weave hats and baskets. Could you spend 8 hours in a cold, dark room, in a cloud of suffocating dust, doing monotonous physical work that makes your whole body ache? Could you breathe that air day after day, knowing that it is slowly killing you so that your family could bake bread? And could you, after doing all that hellish work, give most of your harvest to others without complaint, leaving only the bare minimum for yourself? For us, bread is a product from the store. For them, it's the result of months of struggle, sweat, and ruined lungs. In winter, one of the main tasks was to keep the livestock alive. A breadwinner cow, a few sheep or goats that gave milk and wool, and perhaps a pig. To drive them out into the cold into a separate stable was almost certainly to destroy them. So Anglo-Saxon and medieval peasants used an ingenious and, in our view, shocking strategy. They lived with their animals under one roof, turning their house into a Noah's Ark. Most peasant houses were of the longhouse type. It was an elongated structure where one half, usually by the hearth, was occupied by people, and the other half, the far half, by livestock. Often there was not even a solid partition between the two halves, just a light barrier of rods. This was not a sign of uncleanliness, but a pragmatic solution to several problems at once. First, and most importantly, warmth. A large animal such as a cow generates an enormous amount of heat, comparable to the operation of a small heater. The heat from a few sheep and goats was also significant. In the tight, enclosed space of the hut, this animal heat mixed with heat from the hearth in the people's breathing to create a microclimate that was several vital degrees higher than outside. It was a living central heating system. The floor in the animal part of the house was not removed all winter. Fresh straw was constantly poured on it, and the lower layers, consisting of manure and wet straw, began to mold and decompose. This process, similar to the combustion of a compost heap, produced additional heat from below, working as a primitive floor heating. Second, safety. Keeping livestock in the house meant protecting them from wolves, which came close to villages in winter, and from thieves. A cow was too valuable an asset to risk it. Third, convenience. The mistress did not have to go to a distant stable in a snowstorm to milk the cow. Everything was close by. The soothing mooing of a cow or the bleating of a lamb born right in the hut in the middle of winter were sounds of life and hope. Of course, there was a downside to such a neighborhood that would be a real challenge for modern man. The smell in the hut was unimaginable, a pungent mixture of sweat, smoke, ammonia from manure and straw. Hygiene was at ground zero. Lice, fleas, and flies traveled freely between animals and humans, carrying disease. Noise was constant, mooing, bleating, grunting. You could wake up at night to the sound of a goat sniffing your face. It was an ecosystem in which humans were not the dominant species, but just one of the cohabitants sharing space and warmth, and were constantly at risk of zoonotic diseases, tuberculosis or brucellosis transmitted from livestock. Would you be able to live in the same room as cows and sheep? To sleep, eat, and raise your children in an atmosphere soaked with the smell of manure? Could you accept as normal that your bed and the cattle feeder are a few meters away from each other? Could you find peace and comfort in the sounds and smells that we today associate exclusively with filth and unsanitary conditions? For us, it's a nightmare. To them, it's an ingenious survival strategy. Winter was the only time to get farm equipment ready for the new season. And this was not relaxed work in the workshop, but a real race against time, with life at stake. If your plow wasn't ready by the time spring plowing began, you wouldn't be able to sow the field in time, which meant your family would starve in the fall. It was a job that required incredible foresight, skill, and a deep knowledge of materials. The main and most difficult tool was the plow. It was mostly wooden, and over a season of hard work in the stony soil, its frame cracked and the handles loosened. On long winter evenings by the light of the hearth, the peasant inspected every inch of his plow. He kept a complex three-dimensional diagram of the tool in his head, realizing which part was under what strain. He cut new parts from a pre-cut and dried piece of sturdy ash or elm, adjusting them with axe and knife. He reinforced the joints with new wooden wedges. The wood for this had to be harvested a year or even two in advance so that it would dry properly and not crack. The most valuable part was the iron plowshare, the tip that cut the ground. Iron was expensive. This plowshare would get dull and worn out in a season. In winter, it had to be carried to the village blacksmith. The blacksmith's services cost money or groceries. The blacksmith was an important, almost mystical figure in the village, the lord of fire and metal. He heated the plowshares in a crucible and forged them anew, restoring their sharpness. If the metal was badly worn, the blacksmith could weld a new steel edge to it. This operation was vital and costly. Apart from the plow, everything else was repaired. Wooden forks, rakes, chains, handles for scythes and sickles. All these were made by hand. Special attention was paid to harness for oxen or horses. Leather straps cracked and tore during the year. In winter, they were soaked, carefully smeared with animal fat for elasticity, and then sewed the torn places with thick waxed thread, using a bone or iron awl. The women and children were also busy. They wove new hemp ropes, forged new harvest baskets from willow twigs, harvested from the forest, and repaired sacks. This quiet, laborious work, which lasted for weeks in the semi-darkness of the hut, was the key to the future. Every tool mended, every rope woven was a contribution to a crop that hadn't even been planted yet. There was no margin for error. A hidden crack in the handle, a badly stitched strap, a poorly sharpened plowshare, any one of these missteps could lead to a breakdown at the height of the season, which meant precious days lost and consequently disaster for the crop. Could you, who are used to the fact that any tool can be bought at the store and thrown away in case of breakage, feel this existential weight of responsibility? To realize that the quality of your work with a piece of wood and leather determines whether your children will have food in 9 months? Would you be able, without blueprints and instructions, relying only on the experience of generations, to fix the complex mechanism on which your life depends? For us, it's a hobby. For them, it's a matter of life and death. When we think of clothing, we think of stores and fashion. For the medieval woman, winter was the time when she became a veritable textile factory. The whole process of creating fabric, from the dirty, sheep-smelling fleece to the finished shirt, took place within the walls of the hut and was a chain of laborious, unpleasant, and demanding operations that took hundreds of hours. Everything began in the fall, after shearing the sheep. The wool came into the house, dirty, greasy, full of turnips and excrement. The first task was to clean it. There was no soap. It was too expensive. So the most accessible and effective substance was used as a detergent: fermented urine. In the corner of the hut, there was a pot where the whole family collected urine. Ammonia, which was formed in it by the decomposition of urea, perfectly dissolved lanolin, animal fat, and dirt. Women spent hours soaking and washing wool in this acrid, stinking solution, then rinsed it in ice-cold river water and laid it out to dry by the hearth. After drying, the process of scratching began. With the help of 2 cards, brushes with metal teeth, the woman combed through the wool, untangling the fibers and aligning them. Then it was spinning time. Forget the spinning wheel. That's a later invention. The main tool was a hand spindle with a spinner, a weight made of stone or clay. A woman would pull a strand of wool from the kudeli and, deftly turning the spindle, which worked like a spinner, would twist it into a thread. It was an endless, almost meditative work. Spinning was always and everywhere, sitting by the fire, looking after the children, even while walking around the village. During the winter, hundreds and thousands of meters of yarn had to be spun. If the family was poor and had no sheep, clothes were made of nettles or flax. In summer, they gathered stems, soaked them in water for several weeks until the hard part rotted, then crumpled, cracked, and scratched them, obtaining strong, shiny fibers, from which they also spun yarn. But spinning the thread was only half the job. It had to be woven. In a cramped hut, a bulky vertical loom was set up, occupying a huge space. On it, picking the threads by hand and compacting the rows with a heavy wooden sword, the woman slowly, centimeter by centimeter, created a rough but strong cloth. Homespun. It was hellishly slow work. It could take weeks to create the fabric for one shirt. Before that, the yarn was often dyed using natural dyes harvested in summer: merino root for red, vajda for blue, onion husks for yellow-brown. The dyeing process also took place in the hut, in a smoky cauldron over the hearth. And only then did the cutting and sewing begin. All clothing was simple, with as few seams as possible to save the precious fabric that cost so much labor. Every scrap went to work, for patches or baby clothes. The finished garments were stiff, scratchy, and smelled of smoke, but it was warm and durable. They were a real asset, listed in wills along with livestock. Could you wear clothes knowing they had been washed in urine? Could you sit for hours in the semi-darkness, monotonously twisting a thread, knowing you had miles more of the same to make? Could you devote months of your life to making a single, crude shirt? To us, clothes are a commodity. To them, they are months of women's labor embodied in a scratchy but vital woolen fabric. Winter demanded huge amounts of fuel for heating and cooking, but the entire forest belonged to the Lord. And a trek for firewood was not a peaceful walk, but a risky foray into foreign territory, a real forest war, where the price of defeat could be not only cold, but also injury, a huge fine or prison. A peasant had no right to cut down live trees. This was considered poaching and was severely punished. In some royal forests, there was a particularly harsh forest law, under which one could be blinded or hanged for killing a deer. Illegal cutting of a tree could result in a huge fine, loss of livestock, or, in the worst case, a hand. The forest was patrolled by the Lord's foresters, reeves, who kept a watchful eye on trespassers. The forest was not only a source of resources, but also a place of fear. According to beliefs, not only wolves and robbers, but also evil spirits dwelled in its thicket, so every outing was also a psychological test. The rights of peasants were strictly limited. The main one was the right to stovery, i.e. to collect wood by hook or stick. This meant that only dead wood could be collected, or dry limbs could be knocked off trees with a long pole with a hook. Every day, women and children would head out into the cold forest and wander through the snow for hours, searching for every dry twig. It was hard and inefficient labor, and there was often not enough to go around. Therefore, the peasants took stratagems and risks. At night, at the risk of being caught, they could go into the forest with a small, easily concealed axe and cut down a small tree. They would camouflage stumps with moss and sod to hide the evidence of the crime. They would conspire with neighbors to warn each other of the approach of the forester. There was a constant atmosphere of tension and fear. A peasant caught red-handed would be brought before the court of the manor, and there was no mercy. But the forest was not only a source of firewood. In winter, when there was no grass, peasants had the right to pannage, grazing pigs in the oak forest to feed on acorns. They had the right to cut branches of sharp leaf and ivy to feed goats and sheep. They gathered moss to insulate walls, trumpet mushrooms for making fire, and bark for tanning leather. Charcoal burning was an important winter activity. For this purpose, a hole was dug in the forest. Wood was placed tightly in it, set on fire and covered with earth, leaving small holes for draft. The process of slow smoldering without oxygen lasted several days and required constant supervision. The resulting charcoal was vital to the village blacksmith, as it gave a much higher temperature than firewood. Some manors had a more advanced system, the right to cut in the undergrowth. These were areas of forest where trees were regularly cut down by the root, yielding an abundant shoot of young, straight poles. It was an early form of sustainable forestry, but even it was strictly controlled. Could you go into the forest every day knowing that you were breaking the law and risked being caught and severely punished? Could you feel the constant fear and humiliation of extracting your family's right to heat? For us, heat is the turn of a knob on a radiator. For them, it is the result of daily dangerous guerrilla warfare. Fall on St. Martin's Day, November 11th, was a time of mass slaughter. Most animals, except for breeding animals, were slaughtered because it was impossible to feed them during the winter. The day was bloody, labor-intensive, but it provided a brief period of meat abundance. The main task, however, was to preserve this meat for the long winter, with no refrigerators or freezers. This was true alchemy, where a mistake could lead to spoilage of the precious product or worse, fatal poisoning for the whole family. The main preservatives were salt, smoke, and cold. Salting was the most common method. Meat was rubbed with salt and stacked tightly in wooden barrels, sometimes layered with layers of salt. This process, called dry salting, extracted moisture from the meat, creating an environment unsuitable for bacterial growth. Salt was an expensive commodity, had to be bought or bartered, and was used very sparingly. The quality of salting determined how long meat could be stored. Unsalted meat spoiled quickly. Smoking was another popular method. Pieces of meat, especially pork hams, were hung from the beams right in the hut near the ceiling. Smoke from the open hearth, rising upward, would slowly soak into the meat. This process could last for weeks. The chemicals in the wood smoke, phenols, formaldehyde, had powerful antibacterial and antioxidant properties, and the process dried the meat. The shack was transformed into a smokehouse. Curing and drying were also practiced. Thin strips of meat were hung out in a dry, ventilated place. In the cold climate of England, this method was less reliable, but was still used, especially for fish. The most important product obtained from the slaughter of a pig was lard. The fat was rendered and poured into clay pots. This process removed all the water, and the pure fat, lard in solidified form, could be stored for a very long time. Lard was not only a high-calorie food, but also fuel for sebaceous lamps, and was used to lubricate skin and tools. Nothing went to waste. Intestines were thoroughly washed and used to make sausages, which were then smoked or cured. Blood was collected and made into blood sausage by mixing it with oatmeal and lard. The head and feet were boiled for a long time to make jelly, brawn. Even the skin and bones were used to make glue. But with all these tricks, the risks were enormous. How could you tell if meat was beginning to spoil if it was already salted and smoked? They relied on experience, in the sense of smell. Botulism, salmonellosis, and other food poisoning were frequent causes of death. The flavor of the food was appropriate. Everything was very salty, very smoked, and tough. Fresh meat was practically never eaten in winter. Would you, who are used to hermetically sealed packages and expiration dates, be able to determine by eye and smell the quality of canned meat? Would you be able to eat a piece knowing it could kill you? Would you be able to eat nothing but tough, oversalted, corned beef for weeks on end? For us, food safety was guaranteed by the state. For them, it was the result of their own skill, intuition, and constant mortal risk. Winter was not only a time of lull in fieldwork, but also a time of intensified social and legal life. It was in winter, when the roads became less traveled and the people were gathered in the villages, that the Lord of Manor most often assembled his court. And for the peasant, it was a time of fear, humiliation, and reckoning. It was a day when all bills had to be paid, both literally and figuratively. The manor court was held in the great hall of the Lord's house. The atmosphere was oppressive, a cold, dense room, smelling of smoke and dogs. The Lord, or his steward in a high chair, looking out over the crowd of peasants who had gathered. They stood with their hats off, shuffling from foot to foot, afraid to meet the Lord's gaze. A steward presided, and the peasants themselves were the jurors, plaintiffs, and defendants. This created a complex system where social control was mixed with personal grievances and fear. Gamage jurors were required to report all offenses they witnessed. To keep silent about a neighbor's crime was to risk being fined for concealment. To report meant making an enemy, which in the small world of the village could be dangerous. For one thing, debts and rents were collected at court. It was in winter, when the harvest was gathered and counted, that a peasant had to give the Lord his due share in grain, produce, or money. Default meant serious problems, from fines to confiscation of livestock or implements, which could condemn a family to starvation. Second, all crimes and misdemeanors committed on the manor's territory during the past year were dealt with here. Neighbors denounced each other. John didn't mend his part of the fence, and his pigs trampled my garden. Alice stole a chicken from Marjorie. William was caught by the forester with an axe in the Lord's woods. Punishments were mostly in the form of fines that went into the Lord's treasury. For a brawl, 1 fine. For a brawl with bloodshed, many times more. For more serious misdemeanors or repeated offenses, public and humiliating corporal punishment could be imposed. Flogging or being put to the shame pole or in the stocks. To be put in the stocks meant to be a target of ridicule, insults, and rotten vegetables and dung from your neighbors for a few hours. It was a theater of power and submission. Any show of disrespect to the court or the Lord could be construed as rebellion. Land disputes and questions of inheritance were settled here. All this was recorded in the manor scrolls. Illiterate peasants had to take the scribe's word for it, who entered their debts and obligations into the scroll. Especially humiliating was the procedure of Jeria, inheritance tax. When the head of the family died, his son had to give the Lord the best animal from the yard, the best ox or cow, to get the right to his father's land. For a poor family whose survival depended on draft cattle or milk, This was a disaster, bringing them to the brink of ruin. The winter court was an instrument to maintain order and the Lord's power. It reminded everyone of their place in the hierarchy. For the peasant, it was a day full of anxiety. Would he be summoned? Would he be accused of something? Would the Lord require extra work? Would you be able to stand before a superior who is your landlord, judge, and policeman at the same time? Would you be able to protect your interests without any real rights, relying only on the Lord's favor and ancient customs? Could you live in a system where your neighbors are obliged to denounce you and you to denounce them? We are used to separation of powers and the rule of law. For them, the law was the will of one man. We have already talked about the long winter darkness, but it is important to understand how this darkness affected the very ability to work. Winter did not cancel daily duties, and many of them had to be performed in the near absence of light. This required not only a tremendous strain of vision, but also the development of other senses and skills to a level that is difficult for us to comprehend. The daylight hours in winter in England are very short, about 7-8 hours. All the work that required good light, sewing, fine mending, working with small details, had to be done in that time, huddled around the only window aperture, draped with a bull bubble. But many chores continued after sunset. The only source of light in the hut was the open hearth. It gave a dim, uneven, dancing light that illuminated only the small space around it. One had to sit as close to the fire as possible, risking burning oneself or one's clothes. In this semi-darkness, the women continued to spin. Spinning on a hand spindle is a job that depends a lot on tactile sensations, on the feeling of tension and thickness of the thread in the fingers. An experienced spinner could work almost blindly, relying on muscle memory and touch. But this required incredible concentration and caused tremendous strain. Men mended harnesses, wove ropes, carved small objects from wood. All this work required precision, and doing it in the firelight was a real torture for the eyes. People's eyesight deteriorated very early, but of course, there were no glasses. Cooking also took place in semi-darkness. The hostess determined the amount of grain by touch, cut vegetables, risking to cut herself, check the readiness of the broth, relying on the smell and the sound of boiling. Reed candles, rushlights, were used for additional lighting. This was the most common poor man's lighting. In the summer, they would gather reeds, carefully peel them, leaving only a thin strip of rind for strength, and then repeatedly dip the resulting core into melted animal fat. Such a thin, greasy stick, fixed in a special holder, burned with a dull, smoking flame for only 15-20 minutes, emitting an unpleasant odor. They had to be changed constantly. This life in the dark formed a different perception of the world. Hearing and touch became as important as sight. People learned to navigate their homes by touch, to recognize each other by voice and footsteps. Hands became eyes, but the price for this was high. Constant eye strain, headaches, increased risk of injury and burns. Darkness also affected the psyche. It brought the family closer together, forcing everyone to stick together around the fire, but it also created fears. The world outside the lighted circle was hostile and full of dangers, both real and imagined. Could you, accustomed to bright electric light at all hours of the day, do fine manual labor by the light of the fire? Would you be able to read, write, sew, or mend anything under such conditions? Could you not just endure, but live and work fully when half your life is spent in darkness that can only be dispersed for a few minutes with a smelly grease stick? For us, light is a given. For them, it was a precious and scarce resource that determined the entire routine of their lives and work. Winter was not only a time of cold and hunger, but also a season of disease. Overcrowding, dampness, constant smoke, and weakened immune systems made every peasant hut a perfect incubator for respiratory and infectious diseases. Surviving the winter sickness was one of the main tests of the year, a lottery in which not everyone won. The main enemy was the lungs. Constant inhalation of smoke from an open hearth in an unventilated room led to chronic bronchitis, asthma, and other lung diseases. Winter cough was almost everyone's cough. It was a constant audible background in every hut. The damp, cold air aggravated the situation, and the soot that settled in the lungs made them vulnerable. Pneumonia was frequent and almost always fatal. The crowding of people and animals in the same room contributed to the lightning-fast spread of infections. If one family member got sick, everyone was sick within days. Colds, flu, measles, scarlet fever. These airborne diseases mowed people down, especially children, whose immune systems were weaker. The concept of quarantine did not exist. It was impossible to isolate a sick person in a one-room hut. Weakened by a winter diet poor in vitamins, especially vitamin C, the body could not fight back effectively. Scurvy was not only a sailor's disease, peasants also suffered from it in late winter, manifested by bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pains, and general weakness. There was virtually no cure. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors, liquids, according to which winter diseases were caused by an excess of cold and wet phlegm. Accordingly, they tried to treat them with hot and dry remedies, food with pepper, garlic, onions. The chief healer was a village, knowledgeable woman whose methods combined a deep knowledge of herbal medicine with magical rituals. She offered herbal concoctions to relieve coughs, e.g. from mother and stepmother or thyme, and diaphoretic teas for fever. The sick person was wrapped in skins to sweat it out, but it was powerless against viral and bacterial infections. Antibiotics did not exist. The psychological state of the patient was terrible. He lay in a dark, smoky, cold hut on a stiff straw mattress infested with fleas, listening to the coughs and moans of other family members. There was no relief from the pain, no opportunity for peace and quiet. Recovery depended solely on the strength of one's own body. The fever, which today we knock down with a pill, could last for weeks, exhausting the body and leading to delirium. Could you survive a severe flu or bronchitis without antipyretics, antibiotics, and expectorants? Could you lie feverish in a cold, smelly room full of other sick people with nothing but herbal decoction and prayer? Would you be able to watch your children suffer from high fever and be completely powerless? For us, illness is a temporary inconvenience that is treated with medication. For them, it was a lottery with death. The final and perhaps most underappreciated challenge of winter is the battle psychological. The combination of the long, almost polar night, the cold, constant semi-starvation, illness, isolation, and monotony of existence created tremendous pressure on the psyche. Fighting discouragement and despair was no less important than fighting hunger. Modern psychology knows a condition called seasonal affective disorder, which is caused by lack of sunlight. The medieval peasants spent almost half the year in this state. The short daylight hours, the gray skies, the constant confinement to a dark, smoky hut all led inevitably to apathy and depression. The monotony was murderous. Unlike summer, with its variety of field work, winter activities were extremely monotonous. Hour after hour, day after day, the clatter of the chain in the barn, the whirring of the spindle in the hut, the creak of the knife on the wood. This routine, confined within four walls, could drive one mad. Social isolation, though incomplete, was also keenly felt. Due to bad weather and impassable roads, contact with other villages almost ceased. The world shrank to the size of their village, and often to the size of their hut. How did they combat this? The main weapon was community and ritual. Winter evenings were a time for storytelling. Neighbors would gather around the hearth, and the elders would tell ancient sagas, fairy tales, and lives of the saints. This not only entertained, but also structured time, provided food for thought, and strengthened cultural identity. Songs were another powerful antidepressant. Collective singing is known to relieve stress and create a sense of togetherness. They sang labor songs, ballads, church hymns, and of course, the holidays. The winter cycle was marked by big, colorful holidays that broke up the monotony. Chief among them was Christmas, Yule, which was celebrated for 12 days. It was a time of cessation of work, feasts, games, and caroling. It was a flash of light and merriment in the middle of the dark season that gave people the strength to make it to spring. Festivals such as Plowing Monday or Wassailing were also important not only from a ritualistic point of view, but also from a psychological point of view, introducing variety and allowing to discharge emotions. Could you, accustomed to an endless stream of entertainment and information, endure months of monotony and sensory deprivation? Could you find the inner resources to resist discouragement with nothing but stories, songs, and socializing with a dozen of the same faces? For us, fighting depression was a matter for specialists. For them, it was a matter of whole community and personal resilience. So the winter day of the medieval English peasant comes to an end. The day that began in cold and darkness is ending in them. It was not a day of rest, but 16 hours of continuous, multifaceted struggle. In the dust of the barn, he fought for future bread. In the icy woods for the right to warmth, risking freedom and health. Within the walls of his smoky hut, his family waged an alchemical war against spoilage, turning meat into corned beef and filthy wool into salvageable cloth. His life in winter was far from a pastoral idyll. It was the life of an engineer who had to fix his only plow so he wouldn't starve to death in the spring. The life of a chemist who knew how to use urine to clean wool and salt to preserve. The life of a lawyer trembling before the judgment of his master. The life of a doctor trying to bring down a child's fever with herbs and incantations. The life of a soldier guarding his home from invisible threats. Reflecting on this, it is hard not to wonder, would we, the people of the 21st century, be able to survive in such conditions? The answer is most likely negative. Our bodies are not adapted to this level of physical exertion and constant cold. Our minds are not prepared for this level of isolation, darkness, and fear. Our skills have atrophied, replaced by the convenience of technology. We would fail every one of these 10 tests. The story of Peasant Winter is not a tale of primitiveness. It is a hymn to human resilience, versatility, and incredible ingenuity born out of need. It is a reminder that survival is not a passive state, but an active, all-encompassing, and demanding labor of all the powers of mind and body. If this dive into the harsh but amazing reality of medieval winter was exciting for you, and you want to learn more about how people actually lived, struggled, and survived in the past, give it a like and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Together, we will continue to tear the covers off historical myths and discover the real, authentic past. Don't miss new videos. There are many more amazing stories ahead of you.